This workshop is going to be about asking better questions and getting better answers. And I love this topic because it's changed my life. And it's also a topic that sounds easy and simple, and yet it is definitely not as simple and easy as it feels like it should be. And what I've learned over the last few years is that the way you ask questions changes everything. It's not just the questions you ask, but the way you ask them and the energy with which you approach asking them. And that choosing good questions can be fun, and that when we are not mindful, we choose not good questions much of the time. We mindlessly choose questions, and those questions have significant impact. And so how you ask the questions and what questions you ask can significantly impact whether you feel content with your life or happy with your life, how you experience your marriage, your children, everything. And it also changes the decisions that you feel empowered to make, and therefore it changes what happens in your life. And so this tool of asking better questions and getting better answers is really fabulous. So when we realize that the questions that we ask, which we often don't even notice that we ask because we ask them mindlessly, can get us into trouble, it's a really useful realization and a really useful noticing. And so a lot of questions lead us to feel stuck. And then a better question can lead you to feel ease or feel happier or more calm and get you unstuck. And so learning this, I like to think of it as an art and a skill. And it does take time. I am still working on it, and I've been working on it for about 5 years. So suspend judgment and just play with it and have fun with it. It can change your marriage, it can change your parenting, it can change your career trajectory. If you ask the right question, you might change jobs. And if you don't, you will feel stuck. If you don't ask questions, that's another trouble that sometimes comes up for people. So when we ask questions intentionally, we get intentional answers. If we ask optimistic questions, we get optimistic answers. If we ask powerful questions, we get powerful answers. If we ask loving questions, we get loving answers. And so I encourage you, as you think about your question, think about what kind of question it is you want to ask, and use asking questions as a way to use your brain for you rather than against you. And this topic came up as a workshop topic for two reasons. One is that I gave a talk last weekend on what love would do, which is one of my favorite questions, and we will talk about that. It also came up because I have a client who had what I call a bad mammogram, and the results are not available yet, the final results, but immediately a bad test or a bad diagnosis in a family member, we tend to start asking bad questions. And so one of the things I was coaching her on is, well, how can you ask good questions? And they don't have to be Pollyanna questions. They can be more neutral questions, or they can be better questions. And so realizing that when you have something scary or something bad happening, or I also gave a talk last week on partners who are struggling with mental health and how to show up for that. If we ask better questions, our experience of the whole situation is better. And I know at least one of you here has a loved one who's struggling with medical stuff, same thing. And so thinking about how those questions can really help you. If you ask questions that from a victim place, you'll get victim answers, for example. So these questions are this magical tool that we often don't take advantage of. So they're a way of being mindful. And for those of you that practice mindfulness, which I know many of you who work with me do, mindfulness includes curiosity. And so curiosity is this way of directing your attention with intention. And so thinking about your questions that way and being intentionally curious, it's also a way of what we say, paying attention on purpose. And so when we ask these mindless questions, we're not paying attention on purpose, and we have impacts in our life that we don't necessarily want. So when we ask specific questions with intention, you get possibilities, you get shifts, you get unstuck. And they can be a real strategic approach and an effective approach to making change and enjoying your life and experiencing it differently. So a brief bit about who I am. I know there are some new folks here. I am a pediatrician. I'm a mindful life coach. I also teach yoga, and I do a lot of physician wellness work. And I have used this strategy of questions to completely change my career, probably to save my marriage, I'll say, also to raise like happier, healthier, and more responsible young adults. Mine are all young adults now, but mostly to figure out how to start enjoying my own life. And when I ask different questions, you can see what is good and what is going well. And it's a way to untrain our high achieving brains that habitually ask questions from places of scarcity, from places of imposter syndrome, from places of fear or compare and despair or catastrophizing. So all of that actually plays into our default questions. And most of us who are high achieving women rarely ask questions that lead us to feel content and happy. And so noticing what your default questions are and choosing those can be really amazing. So I want you just to think about what your favorite questions to ask are, and maybe write them down. And by favorite, I don't mean the ones that serve you well, but the ones that you habitually ask by default. What are those questions? And writing them down and just noticing what they are. And then noticing what's the energy with which you usually ask those questions. Do you ask them from a happy place, from a hopeful place, from an optimistic place? Or do you ask them from a stressed space, a space of scarcity, a space of fear or worry or anxiety? And do those questions give you the answers that you're looking for? And then lastly, are those questions empowering, disempowering, neutral, powerful, helpful, directed? How would you describe the collection of your default questions? Anybody want to share one or two of them? You can either pop them in the chat or you can just unmute and share them. Go for it.
The question I ask myself the most often is, what do I have to do today? What's on my chore list? And that is not typically asked with joy and excitement about, the things I need to get done.
Yes.
And
Yes.
to reframe it, I would really need to say, what do I get to do today? And what am I doing today that is fun, that is nurturing, that is helpful?
Yeah.
But my to-do list, my chore list dominates my brain.
And what's the impact of that on your day?
It means that even when I'm doing something that I enjoy, in the back of my mind, I am thinking about the things that I still have to do.
Yeah. And so what if one tool that comes up in coaching a lot in terms of flipping things to better questions is, rather than what I have to do, you did, I get to do, or I choose to do, or the one I love is I want to do. And so whenever I put down, I have to, I always try to flip it to, I want to. And then if I don't want to, it's like, well, why am I doing it then? And even you usually do even want to do the laundry because you want clean clothes, for example, or you want to go to the grocery store because you like to have food in your house. And so even changing that changes that energy. And the other thing you mentioned there that I think is so lovely is that you don't ask them with joy. And I think most of us, when the energy with which we ask a question changes our answer and changes our experience of the answer. And so that's another way of intervening, is choosing a question and asking it from this place of joy. And so using the words you pick, I love words very specifically, but also the energy with which you ask the question. That's beautiful. Anyone else want to share a question? I saw a couple in the chat box too. Supriya, do you want to share?
Yeah, I think what I would say is, more than the question, I think my questions have a lot of always and never. It's a lot of all out and unthinking. Like, why am I always so tired? Why do I never have the time to do this? And to be fair, it's not that I never have the time. It's that I don't have the time that day. And honestly, I think one of the things that I've learned, or I'm learning, trying, is basically trying to say, instead of saying, I don't have the time to work out today, I want to say it as, working out today is not a priority for me. And that immediately flips it. The moment I say, meditation is not a priority for me, my brain's like, no, that's a priority. The time is kind of like a cop-out. If you want to make time, sometimes you can manage it. And if it really is one of those days that you can't make it happen, it makes it okay to not do it. But I think that's one of my big things. It's always and never. It's always piled on to, again, always, to other experiences like it, and never just that thing.
And that is one of the things that I was mentioning, where our default patterns of catastrophizing, or black and white, or all or none, they pop up in our questions too, and noticing that. And there are lots of different ways of asking questions about, even like, well, why do I not want to meditate today? Because it's not a priority. It doesn't fit in my schedule. So you can ask that. Or why do I want to spend the time doing something else? And using that want rather than need. And in the chat box, there's someone saying they always ask their kids what homework they have when they pick them up, and that's stressful. And that, I think, is really powerful, because that's the tone that you set. The questions you ask set the tone of your life. And so perhaps if you're being intentional with the questions you ask, what question do you want to ask your kids when you pick them up from school? And that could be just super amazing. So thinking about, what do you want that experience to be with them in, I'm assuming, the car, and how could you have that be a beautiful experience? And how could you ask a question that sets that intention? And the one that comes to mind, and we'll explore this a little bit, is that, what would love do? What question would love ask when you pick up your kids? And what would be love? What would be a loving question? And Lisa, you have your hand raised. Do you want to share a question?
Sure. Hi. Yeah, so my questions for the kids is, after the, I just haven't had, I feel like I say it in a neutral way, but I just haven't had like a lot of results about it with them. But I asked them, how was your day? What did you learn today? Who made you laugh? And then any homework, any tasks, any kind of like practical things. And I get one-word answers for every single question that I ask. And so I don't really know like what are better questions to connect with them to really get them to open up better.
And I have a thought that you're actually have an agenda to wanting them to open up. And maybe maybe this is not the moment when you pick them up. Like, maybe they're exhausted, or maybe it's not the moment for connecting. And so if my sense is what you're hoping for there, are you hoping for them opening up, or are you hoping to connect with them?
I'm hoping I'm hoping for them to, after a long day, I'm finally getting to watch the Gilmore Girls, which I've never watched before. And like that connection with like Rory and her mom, and, you ask her, how was your day? She kind of just goes down the the day of exactly what happened and how school's going and what boy she's talking
But
to and what her
so
best friend
instead
did.
of thinking about the outcome, which is what we do often, think about what you want in that experience. Like, what are you wanting with your children? You're not really, it doesn't matter all the things that happen in the day, right? You're wanting to connect with them. You said you were wanting them to open up.
Yes.
And so my thought would be, rather than looking at that outcome of what you want them to do, because you're telling a story about what it will mean if they do that, ask yourself a good question. What would connection do?
What would connection do? What would connection do with me and my daughters?
Yeah. When are you asking these questions? Are you asking in the car?
Usually when they come home from school.
Okay. Because my thought is play with it, experiment, because sometimes we don't know the right question, but it may be that just hanging out with her in silence is more connecting, or maybe playing music is connecting. Or maybe when she comes home from school, you are thinking that asking her questions is connecting, but she may be thinking something different.
Right. And I think that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. And so maybe ask, if she's not answering, she's not engaging, that's not what feels connecting to her. So really thinking about what would connection do in that moment. And it's going to look different every day. I don't know how old she is, but if she's a teenager or preteen, like they got all this stuff going on. And so perhaps you're just very present without an agenda for the questions. Because it isn't the question, when we're thinking about questions, it's the question for us. And so the question for you I might ask is, what would an amazing mom do? What would a connected mom do? What would a loving mom do?
Okay.
Because that's focusing on what's in your control.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was focusing on, I'm not asking the right question for them to answer correctly and to connect. And I've listened to so many podcasts and they're like, well, ask them what made them laugh, who they sat with at lunch, like trying to ask all these questions. And I'm still getting one word answers and it just ends. And first it was always grades and homework. And then I started expanding to other things what was the funniest thing that happened and who's your favorite teacher? And I'm trying so hard to just say other things to really
I would
get
maybe not have it be a question thing. I mean, this is more a parenting thing, but I'm thinking choose the energy with which you show up. So if you want connection, show up connecting. If you want relaxation, show up relaxed. If you want love, show up loving. And so I wanted to spend a moment, and we will get back to some of these not good questions and ways to ask better questions. And I think some of this will give you some tools. And one of the purposes of asking questions is not to change what other people do, because that's actually out of our control. We think, and actually for most of you, I think are physicians, we were trained that if we ask the right question, we'll get the right answer. Not necessarily true. Okay. What we can control is ourselves. And so thinking about what questions you want to ask of yourself to change how you show up. And the energy that we show up with changes the energy that others come to the situation with. And so if you show up open, you get more open coming back at you. And so that's why what would love do is my favorite question, because it works for a number of reasons. And so one is this idea of love, which seems maybe woo. What love is very activating. It's very energizing. It's open. It's hopeful. It's optimistic. And so if you can think about that, even for difficult things like a meeting, or if you're having a fight with a spouse, or you're stuck on a decision, or you're having conflict with your mom, you can ask this question, what would love do? And I'm going to explain a little bit more about it. But what I wanted to do, because I do think that experience is more powerful than me just talking at you, is to actually practice asking it in a manner where you might get the answers that you really want. And so sometimes you can't do this because you're driving. But if you're thinking, okay, well, what would love do? What I always do is bring a hand to heart and then another hand to top. So you're really connecting with the fact that you're a human and you have a heart. And that changes all of a sudden your whole physiology shifts and puts you in a different space to get the answers that you might be looking for. It's a more loving energy. And then pausing and taking a deep breath. So breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth with your hands on your heart. And there are studies to show that doing just that decreases the cortisol in your saliva and increases oxytocin circulating around. And so if you're thinking about putting yourself in the right environment to ask a question, the answers that you'll get there will be much more helpful. And so just noticing your hands connecting to the heart and sending yourself love, because that is what love would do. And then you think about a situation where you're feeling stuck or you're challenged or frustrated, or maybe you're trying to decide whether to leave a job or how to connect better with your kids or connect better with a partner or deal with a colleague at work that you're not getting along with or a challenging patient, whatever it might be. So thinking of that thing that you're struggling with and ask yourself this question, what would love do? And then breathe because most of us hold our breath. And when we don't breathe, we feel stuck. And so the first and most important part of this question and what would love do is it's what would love do for you? So we think about love for others always, but start with you. And that's where it gets much more powerful, because if you think about, say you're maybe having a disagreement with your mother or your mother-in-law, and you think about what would love do for you, it wouldn't people please, it wouldn't just accommodate, it wouldn't do things that feel out of alignment. It would allow you to do something that resonates well with you. So thinking about what love would do for you. And then the second part is what love would do for the other people. So if we're applying this to Lisa's situation of wanting to connect with her kids, love for her would show up connecting and open. It would show up with a happy, loving energy. And love for her kids would notice where they are and notice that maybe they're not responding to her efforts in this way. Maybe it would try something different. Maybe it would turn on some music, or maybe it would watch a show with them, or maybe it would ask them what they would like to do, or what if they want to help with something. You're going to have to, teenagers, you have to experiment. There's lots of things to try, but thinking about it that way, asking yourself good questions can be incredibly powerful there. And then I always like to go out one more, what would love do for the whole world? And so that keeps you acting in alignment as well. And so, for example, say you're thinking about, I don't know, leaving your marriage, love for you might do that. Love for your partner or your children would look different. And then love for the whole world, like the whole world wants more love and less conflict. And so in my mind, more love everywhere is good for the world. And so that's why this question is such an open question, and it tends to spark possibility and curiosity. And the other thing is that when you ask a question with an intentional feeling in it, that's the feeling you're going to create. And so you can use that as a tool when you're asking other questions by popping other words in there. So what would peace do? What would compassion do? What would connection do? What would courage do? I've heard, what would faith do? What would harmony do? So you can start to think about what feeling you want more of and use that question very specifically. So especially in parenting and relationships, that can be really, really helpful. But it can also be helpful even in a patient encounter or even in a meeting. I've had a lot of clients who use what would love do, say they're giving notice. If you show up loving, it's a very different conversation than if you show up nervous and scared and worried about how people respond. And if I say it just the right way, it might work out. And so asking that question can shift all of your energy. And then asking it in that loving space with hand to heart feels very, very different than if we ask a question from an anxious spot or rushing. And so that pausing really gets you in a very different space. So thinking about the questions you ask can be super powerful. And the first thing I want to offer is, rather than changing the questions, even just noticing when you're asking questions that are giving you answers you don't want. And so that's where Vicky's question about asking questions about chores, it's like, just notice how your habit is to ask, what do I have to do today? Or how your habit is to ask always never questions, or what's wrong with somebody. Or there was another one in the chat box I wanted to reflect on. Why is he doing that? Or why does this always happen? Or what terrible thing could happen? And so if you notice those default questions, you can choose just to notice them. And that actually leads to a great shift. You can also opt out of asking the question at all. Maybe it's better not to ask the question of all the things I have to do today and just do them, for example. And so sometimes we are someone who's constantly asking questions that don't get us in a space that feels good. You can also switch to a more neutral question, or you can switch to what I would say a good question, which would be empowering, helpful, motivating, or strategic. Lisa, let me, I see your hand raised again if you have another question.
Sorry, yeah, just with what you said with asking the right questions. And
oh, now you're muted. Let's see, let me hear. Oh, I don't know what happened. Go ahead, there you go.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, just with what you were saying was an excellent point, like asking the right questions for harmony, peace, and love. What if you ask that question and you get different answers with what would love do for you, or what would peace or harmony do? Like, let's say for, like, hypothetically, if you were unhappy in a marriage.
Yeah.
So what would love do? Like, you want to get out of the marriage because you're not feeling respected or loved. But what would harmony or peace do? Would, as far as families and children, like what in that type of situation where you're getting different answers to different
you're
questions.
Going to ask one question. You're going to have to ask the one question rather than all of them at once. And so choose whether you want, love to me also incorporates some peace and harmony, honestly. So if you could pick, maybe peace is your priority. So which is higher priority? Maybe harmony is higher priority. But I would guess that there's not much peace and harmony if you're in a marriage you don't want to be. And so ultimately, if you bring it out farther, you will get hopefully the same answer. But if you ask yourself too many different questions all at once, it's confusing. And so I would say, what would love do for me in this marriage? What would love do for my spouse and my children? And what would love do for the world? And the ultimate answer is you want something that meets all of those. And so by asking it in that way, there's something in there that will help meet all of those.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anyone else have any questions at this point? And I did have one other question, which is how many of your questions, if you look at your questions, were they mostly helpful questions or mostly not helpful, disempowering questions? When I first started doing this, most of my questions were not helpful questions. And I didn't realize how much catastrophizing came into my questions. And what if this doesn't turn out well? And what if I make a mistake? And so many, I just, what is wrong with me? Why is my life so hard? What if I can't figure this out? And if you ask those questions, the answers you get are right in line with that. What if I don't figure it out? And then you start going to all the negative things that might cause a problem. And so if you happen to have noticed that your default questions are mostly negative, you're not alone. Most people's default questions are mostly negative until they notice. And so my first invitation is to use that bit of mindfulness to just notice your questions and notice how many of them are negative. And could you just ask an even, like Maybe they can be equally negative and positive, or maybe you can move to asking more neutral questions. You don't have to get Pollyanna. I mean, that's fabulous. And over time, you'll get better and better. And where I want to shift to now is sort of thinking like a primer on helpful questions. And we've actually talked a little bit about it, but I think thinking about it in a little bit more of a strategic way can be really helpful. And so the first thing I already mentioned is the energy and intention behind your question. And so being very intentional. So there's energy that comes from the feeling you have behind the question. And if I go to Lisa's question about trying to connect with her kids, the feeling that she's having when she's asking that question, her questions is disconnected. And so actually generate that connected feeling, and you'll get answers that lead you to more connection. And so noticing, we ask a lot of questions from scarcity. And so when we're coming from this not enough, either I'm an imposter, or I might make a mistake, or I don't, what if something turns out? Our questions tend to have that flavor to them. So really thinking about the energy that you want in your life and asking questions that match that can be a really helpful way to think about questions. And then thinking about also the energy that you come to the question with. So say you feel ashamed, or you're blaming yourself maybe for a bad outcome. What if I did something wrong, for example? That shame comes up in the question. And so noticing that you ask a question from that place, and that impacts the question you ask. When you're afraid, you also ask different questions. And so to me, it's really helpful to notice that. So noticing the energy that you usually ask questions from, and Vicky's questions maybe came from a desire to be productive, or a worry that if she didn't organize herself, she might not be productive. And so just realizing if she assumed that she were going to be productive and she were going to get all this stuff done, she might ask a different question. What do I want to do today? How might it be fun? Just even that little switch might help her think of questions that are going to shift her to a different space. Then setting yourself up physiologically to ask the questions. So if you have a big decision to make, or you're not sure what the answer is, or you're really trying to discover what you want to do about your marriage, for example, the hand to heart and the breathing. For me, actually closing my eyes, you'll notice when I do hand to heart, I close my eyes, because otherwise there's so much input that I can't hear. We're not used to listening. And for many of us, the world is so urgent and busy that we aren't practiced at listening to ourselves. So notice how you ask questions and when you ask them. And can you set yourself up to ask important questions well and get yourself in that right physiologic space? And the physiologic space that I'm encouraging here is the parasympathetic nervous system. So rest, digest, that's where we're open and curious and willing to consider other options. That's where we get answers that are full of possibility and hope. And so using that as a tool, so again, it's not just the question you ask, but how you feel when you ask it in your physiologic environment when you ask it. And that's one of the things that I have really found to be helpful in coaching is sometimes we just want to work on the thought patterns. We're like, I'm just going to memorize some good questions. But if we don't set ourselves up physiologically, it doesn't stick. That's one of the reasons why I bring yoga and mindfulness into it. And when we come with this urgent energy, it doesn't stick. Or we come being mean to ourselves, it doesn't stick. And so setting yourself up for kindness, self-compassion is a talk for another night. But if we're not kind to ourselves and we don't have compassion, and we tend to ask questions that aren't as helpful, and we can't figure out what to do with the answers. And so then a little bit of conversation about questions that you actually want to ask. And so thinking about how you want to use the question. Do you want to feel empowered? Are you wanting to be strategic? Are you wanting to be intentional? What behavior or feeling do you want? And so this question that many of you have heard me ask, what would love do? And I mentioned a bunch of alternatives. That's really looking at a feeling you want to generate. And so if you want in a relationship, for example, you want to feel connected, or you want to feel loved, you put connected or loved in there. You can also ask, what would proud do? Or what would peace do? Or what would kindness do is a favorite one. What would smart do is another one I love. So if you want to feel smart, ask yourself that question. And all of a sudden you get smart answers. And so thinking about how you want to feel is really powerful. You can also use it to channel a thing or a specific energy. And a few of you I recognize from previous sessions. And we had a session a while back about someone going into a difficult meeting and channeling what would a tree do. And so as a yoga teacher, I love this concept of a tree, but I think of trees as graceful and elegant and strong and rooted, and they don't, fall over in storms, and they don't react and whack back and all of those things. And so you can ask this question, say you want to channel the energy of a tree, what would a tree do? In the talk I gave over the last few weeks about loving someone who struggles with their mental health, I gave this vision of what would a lighthouse do. And lighthouses stand there shining, but they don't go out rescuing the boats. And so you can ask that question, like that tends to be your tendency. That can be another thing. Or what would, I was trying to think of the opposite of urgency, and I'm blanking on the word, but what would not urgent do? Or what would strong do? So thinking about that. And then the other way to ask the same question of the what would question is asking the question from the end product that you want, or the belief that you want to have. And so the simplest way to do that for me is, what would my future self do? What would me at 55 wish I had done? And you can kind of think about it that way. Or what would an amazing mom do? What would a connected mom do? What would someone who's in an amazing marriage do if you want to have an amazing marriage, for example? What would, if you want to write a book, what would a best-selling author do? So you can start to think about those kinds of things. If you're trying to channel calm, maybe, or what would a yoga teacher do? I have clients who say, what would Jessie do? And that, because we've had these conversations and they're trying to get back to those thoughts and remember them. So you can have your own trigger there, but channel something that you want, or something that you want to be, that's very easy to connect with, and ask that question. And when you ask it, you can get these sort of vague questions, give you amazing answers that get you unstuck. So it's a really beautiful practice. Anyone have questions about that? And anyone have any different ideas of channeling? What would something do? I've always loved hearing people's ideas of what they're going to pop into that emotion, or future self, or a thing, or an energy. I would love to hear that if you want to throw them in the chat box. So the next group is the what if questions. And I talk a lot about what if. So most of us ask what I would say negative what if questions. What if questions do you guys ask yourselves? And so thinking what if something bad happens? What if I live in California? What if there's an earthquake? What if, I get COVID on the plane? What if my plane is canceled? What if I'm late? What if I miss X? Those are generally the what if questions that we ask. And so I offer to you, what if is awesome if you very intentionally choose what I call positive what ifs. So my favorite one, and everyone that works with me asks this question all the time, and it's fantastic for those of us who are trained catastrophizers or work in healthcare. What if it turns out better than you expect? And if you can't get there, I will say, what if it's not as bad as you think it's going to be? Sometimes we need step ladder thoughts or bridge thoughts. So you can ask bridge questions too. What if it's not as bad as I think it's going to be? Or what if it turns out better than I expect? And then a few others that I really like are, what if I'm right? What if I'm doing it well? Or what if I did it well? Because we tend to think what if I did it wrong? Or what if I get in trouble? And I'd be like, what if you win an award? What if, one of my favorites is, what if it were simple? I tend to make things complicated. So when your brain is spinning in that overdrive, it's what if it were simple? What if you have everything you need? We spend all this time thinking about what we don't have and what we need to do. Or in Vicky's honor, what if you've done everything you will do everything that's most important? What if you get everything that's most important done today? You just leave it at that. How amazing does that feel? What if I don't need to be fixed? Or what if I'm not a mess? You can flip it in that way too. I had someone who was having a medical emergency in her family, and she was worried about being a burden. And so it was well, what if I'm a burden and I don't want to ask for help? And then the question was, what if I'm not a burden? And there's just tremendous relief there. And so thinking about when you're asking a question, you can always throw in not and see, because it's almost always equally likely. And so noticing the negative versus the positive what ifs. And once again, just notice, I mean, you could ask all positive what ifs if you really practiced, but maybe you can just even them out a little bit more. That's my first step. Like, we tend to want to fix it all, but what if you just ask more balanced version of your what if questions? And then how is another one. So how have you been successful? How are you not stuck? How are you resourced? How are you brave enough and smart enough to figure it out? Another one is, how do you want to show up? And using the word want, how can you enjoy the process? So using this question of how is a lovely kind of expansive question, or how is someone that you're not getting along with, how are they just like you? And so I throw these out there, not because there isn't, like, none of them are the perfect question, but I actually have spent a lot of time trying to figure out, like, oh, what's the good question as opposed to the bad question? And so noticing, we always notice how people are different. And so this question for me, how are they just like me? I can always find something, even if I think they're completely different. Maybe if I go back to my time as a pediatrician, you know, the mom and I are just alike because we are both want the child's best health, even if they don't want vaccines and I want them to have vaccines. We both want a healthy child who lives a long life. And so that can get you connected. And that might be a question too for you, Lisa, like how, you know, how are your children like you? They want to be connected to their mom. They just might have a different idea of what to do when they get home, for example. So thinking about it in that way, how can you live your best life is another one I really like. And then the what questions, I also tend to just, I think this gives you an idea of like thinking, what would feel good is a really good one. What are you abundant in? We always look at what we don't have, but what are you abundant in? What are you proud of? What did you do right? Ones that I think are particularly helpful for many of you high achieving women, I think most of you are doctors, is thinking about what you're an expert at. And I know most of us think we're not experts, but I would say, what are you better than 95% of the world at? There's going to be a long list. And these are ways to help you transform that imposter syndrome or the thoughts that you aren't doing things right. It can be a really helpful way to do that. What have you done right? Another one for those of us who tend to always think about the negative is what went well today. So you can have a list of these questions, or maybe you practice asking one of them at the dinner table and everyone asks a question. The other one that I love when I'm stuck is, what is my next step? Or what would my future self recommend? And so these are things we tend to ask, questions that are closed. And so trying to get to this idea of what questions could you ask that you're open. So if, I don't know how many of you have access to the chat box. Oh, what am I good at? Yeah, here's some. What if they say yes? That's a great one. I think we never want to ask because we're worried people will say no. So what if they do say yes? That's a favorite. Oh, and this one, what do I like about myself? That's beautiful. What am I good at? If anyone else wants to pop good ones in the chat box, that would be awesome. And someone else has been using what would a lighthouse do? And what would optimistic do? Yes, I love that one. And I think sometimes just grabbing a question that resonates and enjoying it and practicing it. Charlene.
Yeah, I wrote the what would optimistic do because, you know, I used to, when meeting new people, feel nervous, that kind of thing. But I read something recently about, you know, assume people like you, are going to like you.
Yeah.
Right?
You could ask, what if they like me?
Yeah. So, you know, I was meeting with a couple of people who I was trying to see, would it be possible to develop some kind of work together today? And I just went in with that, you know, of course they're going to like meeting me, and, you know, a really different energy than I often go into meetings with.
Yeah, I love that. What would optimistic do? Because it's also, you know, it's a very loose question. So you can start to think of like random things. Optimistic might go out and sit in the sunshine and have a cup of coffee, or optimistic will go to this party and see if I meet someone. One thought I have based on Supriya's earlier question is, what can I do today? What do I want to do? What am I able to do today? Rather than what am I not able to do? What am I able to do? What do I have time to do today? And that's a different flip of like, why can't I get this done? But what do I have to do for myself today? Or what did I do for myself today? I think that can be a beautiful way to flip it and to really change the energy. And so I think the key thing about questions is before I got into this work, didn't understand how these like ticker tape questions in the back were really changing my whole life experience. And so using questions strategically, it's not my favorite word because it's not very mindful, but intentionally can be really helpful. Although here strategically resonates because I feel like I so often am letting them be in the background mindless and impacting my experience tremendously. And so choosing how you want to ask your questions and what you want them to be. So I would love if any of you want to unmute and just ask like, what 3 questions do you want to take with you? Or something that you want to change about how you ask your questions. I love hearing from others because different voices, you will change someone's life with a question that you came up with. So take a moment and think about it. And if you can unmute and want to share, that would be fabulous. Or even just one question you want to share that you're going to take with you.
Mine was, how do I want to show up?
Yeah, beautiful. That really changes the conversation.
I think I like the nourishing myself bit that somebody posted. So I'm going to make it, what do I want to do today to nourish myself? And if what I want to do today to nourish myself is nothing, then it's going to be nothing. I'm not going to do a thing that day.
Yeah, it's beautiful. What do you want to do to nourish yourself? And how do you want to show up? Those are beautiful. Anyone else want to share a new question or the question they're going to take with them?
I think I just been thinking and listening, and for me, I think a question I would like to use now is, what would patience do? Because I feel like I want to solve everything like right now because it's so painful. And I realize like I'm only one person in this family and I can't solve it all myself. So I really want to just think about, what would patience do?
That is one of my favorites. And as a parent, we should all ask that question. What would patience do?
Yeah, this is it is a parenting related situation.
Yeah.
So
well, and another thought that comes to mind is most of us come to the world with urgency. And so I often think of the urgency tax. And so patience, asking yourself what would patience do, means that you don't pay that urgency stress tax. And what if there's plenty of time to figure it out? And what if it's all going to work out well in the end? Or what if there's nothing to fix right now? Or what if it's not yours to fix? So I'm throwing another.
Yeah, those are super helpful.
And the patience one, just practice that one. What would patience do?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else want to share their question? Any question, any good one that you've come up with? What if this is not mine to fix? Yeah. How many of us fix things that aren't ours to fix? And so I think identifying what is not yours to fix. And sometimes what if it doesn't need to be fixed? What if it's not a problem? Our brains make a lot of problems that maybe they don't need to. Yeah. The other thing is, Supriya mentions in the chat about guilt. And if you have a lot of guilt, notice the questions that you ask that cause you to feel guilty, and maybe stop asking them. Because this absence of questions, we can ask positive questions and we can flip things around, but also noticing the feelings that your questions result in. And there's power in just noticing them and opting out, as we say. And so what if you opted out of bad questions? Even if you aren't sure what good question to ask, we don't have to ask those questions that make us feel urgent and catastrophize and feel guilty and blame and shame. We're all experts at that. So why ask questions that add to that? Thinking about what did I do wrong? Or, if there's a bad outcome, what if you did nothing wrong? But you don't have to, if you can't flip it, just ask yourself, just don't ask the question. We don't need to know for right now. I'm sure someone will tell you if that's the case. So those are, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, MJ.
MJ, I was the one that put in the chat, how can I nourish myself? Because I'm constantly in a stressful situation. And I find if I do something self-caring first, the whole day goes better. It can be yoga with you. It can be a walk in our lovely neighborhood, gardening, painting. And I just try to fit those in around my husband's needs. I'm in a different situation than all of you who are still working. I'm retired, and but I'm still working as a caregiver. I also have found, I ask myself, when a family member, someone close to me is resisting chatting, I ask myself what loving touch would do. And sometimes if my husband's being difficult, I will massage his right SCM, which is always sore, and he just melts. He's like,
yeah,
what was your question? And then he's ready to talk.
Yeah, that's a beautiful one.
Met some physical need that he has. I know his neck always hurts, and so I just approach him with warm hands and some warming cream, and
well, and that's what love would do, would fix
that would fit
first.
It works with my grandkids when I get to see them. It works with my adult kids.
I love it. Anyone else want to share a question that they found helpful that they want to take with them? And any of the tools that seem to resonate. I think a lot of people begin, it's hard to find the useful question. And so that can be just flipping it, adding in the not, adding, like noticing if it's a what if question, what would be the positive version? What if the opposite were true? Can be a lovely place to start, and channeling the feeling or the outcome that you want is a beautiful way to think of questions. So I think that is what I have tonight. Hopefully it's helpful. And I encourage you all to really think about asking questions with intention, rather than just letting the questions show up in your head. And notice for a few weeks, what questions do you ask? And what would you like to ask yourself instead? Because in my experience, changing the questions that you ask is just absolutely amazing. It changes your whole experience of your life, and it changes what you're able to do and what you're willing to do. And so when we ask questions from not a place of fear, but ask them from a place of hope and inspiration, you get very different answers, or ask them from a place of courage. And so my last thought is to think about what questions love would ask for you, because love will bring that energizing, activating energy into your life. And so thinking about that and bringing a hand to heart, because I always like to end with that, sending yourself compassion for all the questions that you have been asking without judgment. What we don't know, we don't know. And now we have this beautiful gift of recognizing the impact of questions and how we might be able to shift them over time. So thank you all so much for coming. We'll hang around a little bit. If people have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out anytime through email. You can find my email on my website. You can join me I'm doing a parenting group coming up shortly, and there'll be a lot of amazing stuff in that group, super helpful tips. It's all about practical things. And, or join me for an MJ for yoga. Most Saturdays. I would love to see you. And we do a lot of thought work, and we actually ask a fair amount of questions in yoga. So you'll get a chance to hear loving, nourishing questions. So I would love to meet any of you there, and be well.